Okay, so it's time for another question and answer session. These are all questions from viewers. If you'd like to leave more questions for the future, please leave them in comment sections and I'll try to pick them up as I can. Let's just crack on because I'm very unlikely to get through all of these questions. So I just wanted to answer this one firstly. Would you consider setting up a Patreon for this channel? So after some consideration, I don't think this is something I'll ever be doing while Lucy Letby is in prison. I'm happy with where I am, and the channel's had a lot of support, and the only support I would really like to ask from people is for them to buy my book when it comes out in July. I might consider doing a Patreon in the future. I might consider the other features that you have on YouTube in the future. Once Lucy's been exonerated, I'll continue with the channel, but I think while Lucy is exonerated, I don't want to have memberships, sponsorships, collaborations with sponsors, Patreon, anything like that. I just want to make content, and I'm happy with the way things are going. I might review this as and when Lucy's exonerated, but not until then. My first point concerns the idea that a future Court of Appeal could potentially give a verdict that the cases against Letby were not beyond reasonable doubt. If such a conclusion were produced, this would not be absolutely would this not be absolutely unsatisfactory and completely outrageous? Firstly, because not only would an objective review of the case be beyond reasonable doubt, but as there was never any real evidence to prove her alleged crimes, the court needs to completely exonerate her and apologise to her. I say this not only because of the damage that's been caused her by the police and court, but because I think we should be very concerned about her safety if and when released. So I'll deal with the final point here firstly. I agree that we should be concerned about Lucy's safety. I'm sure that this will be handled by the authorities to some extent. What they'll put in place, I don't know. It does seem likely she'd need to take an assumed identity or go into some sort of witness protection. I don't know, it's not really my place to say. Other people that have been convicted of similar crimes have managed to live in the community, but I do think Lucy would be vulnerable, potentially. I can't really comment beyond that, but I do agree with you that her safety is of paramount importance. So let me talk about this idea of the case not being proven beyond reasonable doubt, and it means that there's no crimes. So one of the ironic things about this is that because there isn't a definitive act, and as you say, there probably aren't any crimes, this can actually be a barrier to Lucy getting compensation because she can't, in a sense, be proved innocent. If you get these DNA exonerations, then the person has been proved practically innocent, even though even that's not 100%. But because you can't, it's a double negative. You can't really be proved innocent of something that didn't happen. So actually that could be a barrier to Lucy getting compensation. In terms of whether it's unsatisfactory and outrageous, it very obviously is. This whole thing, the more I keep thinking I can't learn any more, or there must be only very trivial things left now, and then something new will come out, and then we'll learn more, and then I think, right, we'll have to revise my book again. It's just unbelievable. It is a calamitous situation that will go down in British history, as I've said many times, and I'm sure it'll be studied across multiple subject areas as an example of how not to do something. The second point I want to make concerns the now very familiar criticism that the pro-guilty lobby used to make against those who could see that the case didn't add up. They would say, did you attend all the court sessions? If you didn't, then you are not in the position to comment on the case. There was evidence you don't know about. I attended the court and she's guilty. Well, I could say something specific about attending the court, but I'll wait for that. You will learn more about this in my book. Let's just say that. About attending the court. As you described them, the pro-guilty lobby, none of them, as far as I'm aware, with the exception of Liz Hull, and I don't think Judith Moritz would be part of this anymore. She's just quietly sloped away now. I think Liz Hull is the last member of the pro-guilty lobby, apart from those who actually gave evidence in court, who attended every day of the court. Just because someone turned up to a couple of days, that doesn't give them an advantage over anyone else. That's just complete nonsense, in common with many things that they say. In terms of the criticism that you didn't attend court, so you're not allowed an opinion. There's two things to say about this. The first thing is, as I've said numerous times, it's very clear to me that court proceedings should be recorded, or at the very least that complete transcripts should be made widely available at no cost, or at the very least at a trivial cost, not £100,000, or even 10,000 is way too much, or thousands of pounds. It should be some trivial amount of money to cover administration, perhaps. Obviously, I believe it should be available free. I believe that the court proceedings should be recorded. Then this argument is meaningless. The court shouldn't be some secretive thing just for a handful of people who are able to attend. It should be transparent. The second thing I would say is that this idea that people who didn't attend court don't know about the evidence, that's just dead now. It's dead in the water. We know everything that happened in this court case. Everything has come out. By now, if there was anything significant in the court sessions that we didn't know about, when you consider that we've seen lots of transcripts, I can't say what I was just about to say then, unfortunately. I've spoken to people that have been in court. I have seen a lot of the transcripts. Court reporting fills in all the gaps. Multiple people have been doing this. We've been looking at everything in forensic detail. Of course, all the evidence that was out in court has now been discussed. Experts have looked at all the medical documents. What could there possibly be at this point that we didn't know about? Someone would have said something by now. Someone would have said, "Oh, actually, we forgot to mention there was CCTV in the hospital and someone seen Lucy doing something." Obviously, we know that hasn't happened. There's nothing of any substance left from this court case that hasn't been analysed, indeed in great depth. So this idea that, you're not allowed to have an opinion if you weren't in court, total rubbish. Could Lucy have just refused to turn up to the second trial, especially as there was no point? So the answer to the question is yes. Anyone can refuse to turn up to trial, and you will be found guilty in your absence. So therefore, it's not correct that there was no point. It was very important for Lucy to go out there and still contest the verdict, give her evidence, and indicate, I am an innocent person. In fact, I think that thing that she did with great dignity at the end of the trial, where she just held her hands out and said, "I'm innocent," very quietly to the jury, that's a very poignant moment. But in fact, although I completely take your point, and it must have been demoralising for her, and I think she showed incredible dignity in the second trial, there was actually a point to it, because otherwise she would have been found guilty in her absence, and can you imagine the amount of mileage that would have been made out of that? Chris, another question for another day. Apparently English law states that a machine or computer must be shown to be not working correctly by the defence for the defence to succeed. Yes, so this was a big contention in the Post Office inquiry. The prosecution does not have to demonstrate it works. I gleaned this from the Post Office inquiry, and this, of course, resulted in thousands of false convictions. It's not quite thousands, but it's hundreds, certainly. In Lucy's insulin cases, the testing machine came with a big red warning labelled by Roche, stating not to be used for forensic testing, therefore it was not working correctly at the material time. The two positions Lucy's conviction this rule are not consistent. Any lawyers out there care to explain? So I think that the answer to your question is that, as with the Post Office inquiry, there is a presumption that machinery is working correctly. That's why they got the people up there from the laboratory to say, is this a reliable result? And they said yes. I think that it's important to demonstrate that the insulin results are not solid, and this is a valid line of defence for Lucy at the Court of Appeal. But from the original court's perspective, they just said, well, it's a machine. Is there any indication anything was wrong? And they went to the lab people, and the lab people said no. So that similar things, of course, occur in the Post Office inquiry, where I'm not sure, I'm not privy to the details because I've not studied that in the same depth. But as far as I know, what happened is representatives of Samsung just said the machine's fine. We know our Horizon machine is great. And then it was taken as viable, legitimate evidence, even though the prosecution of the Post Office, sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses was absolutely ludicrous. But this is just the way the court system works. This is one of the many, many reasons why it needs to be updated and it needs to evolve. In view of the amount of controversy surrounding the convictions and trial, is there a possibility of an application to the Privy Council to overturn the sentencing and allow new facts to be presented? So I can only give my opinion on this. Privy Council, for people that don't know, is a council of very high-ranking people who preside over various matters. To give you one example, the Privy Council decide whether or not the BBC licence fee arrangement will be renewed. Sir David Davis has been on the Privy Council. Some people that I respect have been on the Privy Council, but I would say that the possibility of the Privy Council deciding to overturn a sentence and conviction of this magnitude is unthinkable. It's just not going to happen, and I'm not sure they have the legal power to do that. But I just don't think there's any point really in researching this in depth, because it's just not going to happen. We've taken the legal route with Lucy. That's what we're going to have to do. It's clear the government are not going to step in. It's clear the establishment are not going to step in any way. I hope the political pressure can continue to be increased, and I think that's perfectly possible. But just going to Privy Council and saying you need to overturn this is just not going to work, I'm afraid. Is it known if Brearey offered Dr. B/V support or statements during the inquest for baby Noah? It's not known by me. Obviously someone will know this. I would suggest that such information has been kept very quiet. The difference between the hospital at that time and all the information that's come out from the Thirlwell inquiry is that because of the crimes that were alleged at the Council Chester, there's been this enormous public inquiry. Typically, there isn't an enormous inquiry into even a very unfortunate situation such as Noah Robinson, who sadly passed away, for people that may not know. Under normal circumstances, just one death at a hospital, there's all kinds of issues related to patient confidentiality. It's very difficult to get information from a hospital regarding an issue such as this. So I think even searching for it is essentially pointless, and it's just a question that is impossible to answer, unfortunately. There's something very odd about Brearey's preoccupation with Lucy. It could be reasonably be described as fanatical, obsessive, and even irrational, particularly given his concerns were never validated by those working closely with Lucy. In fact, opinion of Lucy directly contradicted his concerns. The analogy I would invoke would be that the nursing team at that time, given the clearly described circumstances, were akin to the camaraderie experienced by a band of brothers in the thick of battle. Why did this not shake Brearey's belief? What caused him to be so dogged and single-minded in not relinquishing his belief? A realisation that he could have been wrong doesn't seem to have occurred to him, no doubt absolute conviction and certainty despite opposing opinion expressed by those who knew her best. To repeat, I believe there is something very irregular in his perception of Lucy that might ultimately shed light on how this whole debacle got started. So an interesting comment and questions. Let me deal with the last comment first again. So in terms of how this whole debacle got started, I don't think we'll ever hear the truth about this, because the only way we'll ever know for sure would be if the consultants indicated transparently and explicitly why they became preoccupied. Even if they do, we're never going to know for sure, unless they just came out and said, we deliberately targeted Lucy, which I don't expect to happen for 1 second. Then we'll never know, because if they say, oh, we just thought there were too many deaths on the unit and we became concerned, you know, what I've expressed previously, I think, is a likely explanation of it just became something that they had self-serving reasons to believe, and they genuinely were concerned. And so it gathered a kind of unstoppable momentum, and then other possible more likely explanations somehow got sidelined. I still think that's the most likely explanation, but even if Dr. Brearey, for example, says that, we'll never know if it's true, because we don't, you know, he can keep the truth in his own brain, and we're never going to be any the wiser. In terms about why this didn't shake his belief, it seems very clear that Brearey and Jayaram in particular, but Brearey as the ringleader, became, as you say, obsessed with the guilt of Lucy, and Lucy being the explanation for what was occurring on the unit. As I mentioned previously, this was a very self-serving perspective. So when you have a situation where there's a self-serving perspective, and then there are several people that all share that self-serving perspective, and they all have a reason to think the same way, things can get out of control. And And then, as many people have pointed out, I mean, funnily enough, I haven't told my cleaner about this, so I need someone to clean my house. Very much so. So I have a cleaner, and I hadn't explained to her about what I'm doing. I've just told her I'm doing something important. I'll tell you when the time's right. So quite recently, I told her, and she was very supportive, and she was already interested, and she's taken more of an interest since I told her, and she's watched videos about it and stuff. And one of the first things when we had a proper conversation about it, she said to me was, could they have been covering... She didn't know as much, obviously 1% of what I know about it, and she didn't know any specific details, but intuitively, she just asked, could they be covering up their own mistakes at the hospital? And I said, yes, both consciously and subconsciously, they could be doing that. So there are many factors that could have collectively caused this. And I don't think it's one single solitary reason. I think there are a variety of reasons. You talk about he must have believed that he couldn't. He has absolute conviction and certainty in the rightness of his own views. A lot of that can come from being a consultant. You know, we've discussed this many times on the channel. People that have worked in hospitals have discussed it. Consultants, to use the phrase of Dr. Evans, are almost automatically deferred to, and they're treated like gods almost. So it comes to the point where they think they can understand anything, and Dr. Evans is a very obvious manifestation of that, where he thinks he can give an opinion on any topic, even though he's not particularly bright. He's not particularly coherent, not particularly articulate, not particularly knowledgeable, not particularly well read, it would seem, and yet he will still just give an opinion on stuff that he knows literally nothing about. I mean, I've made the example of Welsh independence many times previously. I'm not going to go over that again, but literally hasn't got a clue what he's talking about. He doesn't know the first thing about economics. And I think that's a big part of it, but I think we're never going to have a satisfactory reason. I think it can be one thing, I think it's more likely to be many things, but we're never going to know for sure. But I hope that kind of answers your question. It's very difficult to give you, like a definitive answer. If Brearey was genuinely concerned with baby survival, why wasn't he concerned with the drainage problem in his unit? Why didn't he downgrade the unit until the drainage issues were resolved in order to save more babies? No, Brearey's own shortcomings were self-interestedly excluded from his drawer of doom. So that I think that you're absolutely right to cite this self-interest, as I've just discussed. In terms of why he wasn't concerned with the drainage problem, I'm sure he was concerned, and I'm sure it was something they considered. They obviously didn't deal with it in the right way. But something I've said previously is, often in organisations, again, it's particularly true when there's a self-serving reason not to make the big decision. But typically, even when there isn't, no one likes to make these nuclear decisions of, let's shut the unit, let's completely change the sewage system, let's pull all the drains out, people want to mend and make do. What better example of that could you have than sticking a nappy on the ceiling? And that's typical, because people don't want to make the big decisions, because when big decisions have to be made, people's heads are on the block. And I don't see why it would have been the paediatrician's head on the block in this circumstance. It would really have been a state management issue and an executive issue. But if there was a big inquiry into the hospital, then potentially stuff could have been uncovered. Again, we'll never know for sure how he felt about it, how Jayaram and the other consultants felt about it. But there were, again, self-serving reasons, as you say yourself, for them to just think, right, let's keep this in-house, let's try and manage the sewage issue, let's not close things down, let's not escalate this too much, because that could be bad for us. Where Yvonne says they're looking for a new neonatal lead, do you think they are talking about replacing Brearey, or do you think they're talking about some sort of nursing neonatal lead role that may be suitable for Lucy Letby? It's doubtful that Lucy would have become... She could potentially have been upgraded, but she wouldn't have become the neonatal nursing lead. But yeah, I think, as far as I know, they're talking about having advanced neonatal nurse practitioners, because this was recognised by the Royal College in its report, and they'd made previous ANNPs, such as Michelle Warden, redundant. So yes, they won't be talking about replacing Brearey. Once you've got a job in that type of organisation, the only way you leave is if you are sacked, or you move to another hospital, or you retire. If you've got a job and you're in place, they can't. It's not like a football club where they go, right, the centre forward's not performing, so we'll get rid of him. it's talking about bringing in a new position, essentially, especially as Yvonne Farmer's affiliated with the nursing unit, the department and team. Chris, I was wondering if any of Lucy's colleagues, family members, or any parents or any of the babies have come forward to support Lucy publicly or question what happened to their babies. So Lucy's had some support from colleagues. It's very difficult for colleagues to speak out because they're under pressure. In terms of family members, obviously Lucy's family and Lucy's friends have supported her, but in terms of parents of the babies, that hasn't happened yet. Whether it will happen, I don't know. It's a difficult thing for them because they've spent a long time under the wing of the police and so forth, and they now would have a difficult kind of psychological journey they would have to go on to turn their back on everything that they'd come to trust. So whether that will ever happen, I don't know. There seems to be a lack of support for Lucy from anyone other than the experts discussing this. Have any of the babies' families questioned any of this? Have any of her work colleagues come out to say they support or question their conviction, or any of the doctors or senior staff from the hospital or ward? So I kind of answered all of that. Very difficult for people in the hospitals to come out. They're going to be under enormous pressure. There's a veil being drawn around the hospital. You couldn't feel 100% certain that if you came out, you could end up being targeted by the police. Who knows what's going to happen? So very difficult for colleagues to come out. It would be the end of their career, of course, if they did it anything other than anonymously. There are all sorts of issues. Let's just say that. So there hasn't been that kind of support yet. Maybe it can happen in the future. I hope desperately that the parents who sadly lost infants can look at this information dispassionately and realise that what they've been told is just intellectually, factually incorrect. But it will be very difficult for them. Do we know at what point Lucy's union, the RCN, stopped representing her and abandoned her? Happy New Year, Chris, and thank you so much for all you have done and continue to do. Thank you very much. Appreciate the support. In terms of the RCN, Royal College of Nursing, they essentially stopped abandoning her they stopped representing her and abandoned her as soon as it went to the police. I kind of discussed this in a previous, I think it was in a live stream, but I've maybe discussed it in a previous video, where the thing about organisations is they always know what's in their interest. So as soon as you get a situation where, if they were going to support Lucy once it was a police matter and she'd been accused of murdering infants, then they would have to really stick their neck out. And if Lucy was found guilty, which of course she was, they would then be heavily criticised. Now, personally, I don't think that's a satisfactory reason for them not supporting her. I think it should be mandatory and requisite for them to support her. But ultimately, as I say, these organisations, big organisations, they always know what's in their interest. They never want to do things that are controversial. And they just decided, well, this is too hot for us. We're not going to help her. We're just going to wait and see what happens. And obviously they're happy with that position, seemingly. Listening to this, surely this was vital evidence in Lucy's trial. Why wasn't Hayley Cooper brought as a defence witness? So when it comes to any issues of this nature, I have no idea why Ben Myers did what Ben Myers did. I really have no idea why he chose strategically to do numerous things that he chose to do. I do think I understand some of his decisions, but I couldn't even begin to tell you why certain witnesses who could have been they could have been acquired for the court case, then called, who could have given vital evidence. I have no idea why that didn't happen. It could be because they were, I was going to say something then, but I mean, I really just have no idea. I don't know why Myers was so opposed to calling witnesses and so opposed to finding people to represent Lucy. I just don't know. Consultants wanted Lucy fired before going to the police. For what? When the police found her innocent of allegations, which they did, the union would have taken the consultants and trusted the cleaners once she was in receipt of a police investigation. Once peaks of interest in Evans rocks up, reputations of all concerned were in the mud. Why wasn't Lucy interviewed by police when they found her innocent? Out of sensitivity, it would have been better for her if they did so. She could set the wheels in motion on bringing her accusers down. So, I don't know if it's true that the consultants wanted her fired before going to the police. They were always very much focused on a police investigation, or certainly from well before the police were ultimately contacted. It's true that, I mean, it would be interesting to know, but I've surmised and I believe that when there was a letter from Dr. Murthy Salady when he wrote to the other consultants and said, we need to refer this to the police and we need to accept that we're suspects. If that had happened at that time, which was 10 months before the case was referred to the police, as I say, Dr. Evans may not have been available. They may not have found a suitable specialist, or the specialist that they did find may have killed the case completely. In those circumstances, when the police went back to the executives and said, we've discussed this with the medical expert couldn't find any evidence of malfeasance, that's the end of our investigation. What the consequences would be at that time for the consultants, it's hard to say. There's still very powerful people within the hospital, but it certainly would have made their position difficult. Let's just say that. They have taken an enormous risk, but the more that I speak to people, the more it seems that consultants could weasel their way out of something, potentially, even something of this magnitude. So maybe they were confident that, look, whatever happens, they need us more than we need them. We can leave and go to another hospital. But they can't just sack all the paediatric team. And that's something that there is a point where I think it's Brearey, but it's one of the consultants says, we've been looking elsewhere. And he knows he's holding that over the head of the executives, because the executive says, well, we certainly don't want you all to leave, because imagine if they suddenly lost their entire paediatric team. That's going to be very difficult to replace. It's going to put the hospital in an enormously vulnerable position. Even one or two doctors leaving, they'll have to replace very quickly. So maybe they were just confident that whatever happens, you can't touch us because we're too important. It would be interesting to know the involvement of other consultants in this matter. We know that Dr. Brearey was apparently the first to voice his concerns, that Lucy Letby appeared to be present on more occasions than anyone else. We also know that Dr. Jayaram appears to have joined him soon after, and that other consultants, we are told, also raised concerns before Brearey told us it was a gang of 7. So I'll just continue with the next bit. That inquiry document makes it clear that the suspicions were initially only coming from one person, Stephen Brearey, and that he went out to form his gang by getting others on his side. So does that mean Jayaram may have been pressured by Stephen to give his false evidence? Let's deal with the last question first. Of course this is possible, but there's no evidence to support that, so we don't know why Dr. Jayaram decided to suddenly mention this tube incident that, as we know, is complete rubbish. In terms of the evolution of the Gang of 7, it's clear that Dr. Brearey, as I say, was not only the ringleader, but he was the one who was most fixated with this idea that Lucy was responsible. Dr. Jayaram came on board quite early, and if you look at the Thirlwell inquiry, and if you look at the documents, if you look at the email chains that exist, it's pretty much it's usually Dr. Brearey, sometimes Dr. Jayaram, emailing the other consultants, and that there isn't an enormous amount of support that is tangible in the Thirlwell documents for Brearey and Jayaram. We've seen Dr. Gibbs in the Netflix documentary recently, and he was a lot more mild, even in that documentary, than Dr. Brearey and Dr. Jayaram. Susie Holt did offer some support. I've made a video on her, and she went to the police station. She was a relatively new doctor on the unit. She certainly wasn't centrally involved in this. We've got this comment from this guy McCormack who made this unpleasant comment about Lucy in the meeting, but he's almost a marginal figure. We barely hear from him at any other time. Dr. Murthy Salady obviously had doubts, and they eventually managed to convince him. All I can say is that Dr. Brearey is very good at convincing people of things by fair means and foul, and he just kept hammering away and hammering away and hammering away at it until they fell in line with him. And I guess there was a certain pressure to do that because he was the paediatric lead. So I think that kind of covers your question. That there will have been stuff going on behind the scenes we don't know about that's not documented, but there's an enormous amount that's documented, and I think that's enough to draw the conclusion that I've just explained there. Wasn't the door swipe data error discovered by the clowns at Cheshire Police after a post-trial evidence review? I think that's how it was discovered, yes. It's an extraordinary thing. It really begs the question as why they didn't try to keep it quiet, because they're not exactly what I would describe as a transparent organisation. Maybe they just thought there was no way. This begs the question of whether the Crown Prosecution Service were involved, because they would be less likely to keep something quiet, of course. So I'm not entirely sure how this was discovered. Again, I don't think we'll ever know the full story, because Cheshire Police Crown Prosecution Service have tried to downplay it, and Cheshire Police never make any reference to it and would rather just sweep it under the carpet. So I don't think we'll ever know with complete certainty, but I think what you're surmising is essentially correct. Was the door swipe material ever disclosed to Lucy's defence counsel? No, because it only turned up after the trial. So in the original trial, Lucy's defence assumed that all of the door swipe material was correct, where of course we know it's anything but correct. Even if it hadn't been reversed, there's all kinds of other problems with the door swipe evidence, but obviously the fact they reversed large swathes of it just makes it utterly ridiculous. From what I am hearing in this video, it clearly passes the test for disclosure, as it undermines the prosecution case. So I'm sure that it will form part of the submission for Lucy's appeal, a leave to appeal, and ultimately the appeal in the Court of Appeal. But it wasn't passed to Lucy's defence counsel because it wasn't made public knowledge at the time, and therefore it can't have been disclosed because it was found in a post-trial climate, essentially. If these professional consultants actually believe Lucy Letby was harming babies, why were they behaving like school bullies and calling her names, putting themselves in a position where they were in trouble and had to apologise instead of using proper procedures? Is it because they were frightened of scrutiny? I think that really comes down to human nature. I mean, there are many reasons that I quit the last job I ever did and became a writer. And thank God I made that decision. That was the best decision of my life. It changed my life, and I'm extremely grateful. But one of the many reasons why I decided to make that decision was I got sick of working in workplaces with just people seem to have a complete inability to behave maturely and get on with one another. And I think a workplace amplifies that, because there's always the room for like pettiness and politics and backstabbing and one-upmanship and everything else that I'm sure many of you, probably most of you, have experienced in previous workplaces. So I think the simple answer for why they behave like school bullies is that a lot of people are lacking in maturity. Maturity is not something that you automatically find in adults, sadly. I mentioned this story previously about the cleaner where I used to work having a crush on me because basically I was the only person that was nice to her. It's not for any particular reason. It's not really... I wasn't even... and I want to emphasise, I was only courteous. I was only courteous to her like I would be to anyone else. I didn't even do anything. But because everyone else was, quite rude to her, or a lot of other people were rude to her and no one was particularly nice to her, And that's just... it just seems to be the norm. It just seems to be the way people behave. Adults don't always engage in adult behaviour. So I don't think it was anything to do with scrutiny. I just think they're just immature, basically. Lucy's been robbed of years of her life that she can never recover, and the longer they delay correcting this miscarriage of justice, the more Lucy's at risk of losing her parents. Are they hoping people will just stop questioning and talking about it? So I can see why you would say that, because the criminal justice system does move at the speed of tectonic plates. But it's actually moving faster for Lucy than it does for most people. I think they know this isn't going away. There's no prospect this is going away. I mean, even since the Netflix came out, when in the initial aftermath of that, all of my numbers doubled. And I know the Facebook group that I've sometimes post on, I don't really get much time to check it. The members have doubled in like a couple of weeks. And everyone is talking about this. It's not going to go away. There's no prospect that it's going to go away. It's too big. There's too many experts involved. They know that that's not going to happen. I think actually they're moving as quickly as they possibly can, given the glacial pace of the criminal justice system. I can see why you think that this is slow, but it's actually relatively quick. Even the Crown Prosecution Service rejecting those cases, that may have seemed slow, but that was actually pretty quick for the number of murder allegations they were dealing with. And that was indicative of how much the system is focusing on this situation. Regarding compensation, I assume this is just the justice system protecting itself, but something I don't understand as a legal principle is the high barrier to receiving compensation. Criminal trials are based on certainty. Surely if you're seeking monetary compensation, this ought to be akin to a civil matter. So the high possibility of a wrongful conviction should be good enough. I am of course describing how I think it ought to work, but can someone please explain why this isn't the case? I'd previously had this thought when looking at Sam Hallam's case. So I think, firstly, you're correct in your assumption. It is just the justice system protecting itself on one level, but I think it also has the distinct whiff of state involvement, because if you started paying out compensation every time someone was wrongly convicted and then exonerated, this could get very, very expensive. So although it's a decision it definitely has the imprint of the justice system protecting itself, but also it's ultimately the state that would pay this out. So I think it does also smack very much of the government thinking, right, we need to do something to protect ourselves here because there are clearly going to be loads of miscarriages of justice. In terms of the kind of ethical argument that you're making, I agree with you. If you're wrongfully convicted and then exonerated, then you should be compensated. But there are some pretty sick people out there, and at some point someone came up with the idea that we should charge wrongfully convicted prisoners for their board and lodging. Now, can you imagine the twisted mind of the individual that first came up with that? And not only did it come into this man or woman's mind, but also the mechanism that I have in my head where I think, should I say this or not? No, I shouldn't say this. A bit like in Peep Show. Big fan of Peep Show. Where you hear the characters' thoughts and they don't say a lot of things that they think. Instead of this person thinking, I can't possibly say that, that's an absolute abomination, there's no way I can suggest that we charge prisoners that have been wrongfully convicted for their board and lodging. Instead, this person said, you know what, we could charge prisoners for their board and lodging. That would reduce our compensation liability. So some people really have no conscience. They're just about themselves. And I think the legal profession, I don't mean to be unduly critical, but I do think it disproportionately attracts people like that. So, yes, morally and ethically what he's saying is true, but unfortunately that's not the way things work. The jokes about Liz Hull will never get old, but it got me thinking. She says it so much like all the time, many times in one episode interview. What is that about? Is getting up and going to a place of work every day unusual for Liz? Is a court reporter role usually weeks on end in court every day? Is there normally a lot of working from home and relaying verdicts? Was there a special exception made for this case? Payments. Is it simply the case that the Mail saw that she was local and tasked her and paid her to do this? I struggle to make this make sense. Well, I'm glad you enjoy the jokes about Liz, and I'll never get bored of telling them. Don't worry. So let's go through these questions one by one. So in terms of Liz going on and on about this, I just think it's simply her attempting to assert her credibility. She knows that she's one of a very limited number of people that did go to court every day, and so she doesn't have much of a sense of self-irony. I would suggest she doesn't have much of a sense of irony at all. So she's perfectly happy to just sit, every time she says, of course I was in court every day, it's just her lording it over everyone else, effectively, in my opinion. In terms of whether it's unusual, I don't know what her day usually looks like, but she's been to other court cases since. She does court reporting for the Mail now, so it shouldn't have been that unusual. I think it's just merely the length of the trial. Obviously, the prominence and the fact she's done a podcast makes it very, very different for her. In terms of the court reporter role, then yes, it can go on for weeks or months, depending on the trial. Obviously, usually trials don't go on for this long, but this was an extremely unusual court case for many reasons. I wouldn't think there'd be a lot of working from home. They have to go to court to observe the proceedings, so I don't think there'd be any working from home. And I think once Liz Hall started, I'm sure that fame started to flash before her eyes. So I don't think she was going to allow anyone to take. I don't think she was going to relinquish control of this case. I think she was going to turn up to court as much as she possibly could. So whether or not the Mail would have said to her, "You could take a few days off" or whatever, just as Nick Johnson wasn't the prosecuting barrister in every single moment of the court case. Sometimes his junior, Simon Driver, was involved. I'm sure she could have got time off, but I don't think that she wanted that. I think she wanted this to be her defining moment in her career. I don't think it's the case that she was local. I think she just regular court reporting for the Mail. They won't have a large number of court reporters, and she would be an obvious choice, obviously given her proximity to the court as well. Hi Chris, Happy New Year. I have a topic suggestion for your next pod, just to prove how unreliable memory is, covering other erroneous convictions based on, for example, lineups. Wouldn't it be great if someone documents, say, 1 hour on a neonatology ward, what happened that day, and then asked people 2 years later what their recollections were? This would be an interesting topic for a student research project. I agree, and of course their recollections would be inaccurate. I've mentioned previously, I think the unreliability of memory is an interesting topic generally, but something I've noticed is that you'll get people, sportsmen and sportswomen, will talk about matches they played in, and unless it was an incredibly important one in their career, even then they'll often get the details wrong. But I've heard so many stories about various matches that took place, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, we lost 4-0, or this happened in the 53rd minute," or whatever. They're almost always wrong. The kind of themes of what they're talking about are usually correct, but the details are usually wrong, because we're not that good at remembering them. Another simple demonstration of this was the game that used to happen at the end of the Generation game quiz show, where a load of items would go past on a conveyor belt, and you had to try to remember them all. Almost impossible to remember all of them, and often difficult to remember a lot of them, because that's just not how our memory works, and it's not how our brains work. So obviously Cheshire Police are unable to understand this, but that's not hugely surprising for me. Hello, I hope you're feeling refreshed and enjoyed the break. I have a question. If David Davis's complaint about Dr. Jayaram is looked into, would this maybe push forward a date for Lucy to come out of prison? Thank you as ever for all your help. So glad for this community. Well, thank you for your support. That's very much appreciated. Yes, it could have done if the police properly investigated Dr. Jayaram, and if they charged him based on this information, then it could make a big difference in Lucy's case. However, unfortunately, they're never going to do that, because they'd be completely destroying their own narrative, and they're feeling more and more under pressure, rightly so, as things get worse and worse for them. So we're never going to hear anything about these allegations and complaints, which is completely wrong, but unfortunately, that's just the way it is. And this isn't going to help Lucy. In the long run, it might count against Dr. Jayaram, but in the short to medium term, I don't think it's going to help Lucy, unfortunately. Is there any way Lucy could get a royal pardon and then have her convictions overturned at a later date? It's possible that she could get a pardon eventually, but unfortunately, all of these ideas about ways to get Lucy out of prison are just not going to work. That's just not going to happen. She's not going to be given a royal pardon while she's in prison. It's just not going to happen, unfortunately. That's not the way the establishment works. I'm afraid this is just simply untenable. We're just going to have to accept that we have to go down the legal route, and hopefully that's going to work out, and hopefully it's going to work out in a relatively short time frame. One thing I haven't heard mentioned is how the pandemic might have affected the trial. So this is an interesting question. The entire country was having difficulty functioning due to restrictions. Is it possible the prosecution were able to bypass checks and balances that would be present during more normal times? Did the defence find it harder to get their act together? Were expert witnesses even harder to book during these difficult times? All very valid and interesting questions, I think. So I've done a bit of digging and research in relation to this, and there are 5 areas where it can be identified through documentation that there were definite impacts, broadly speaking, on the way the criminal justice system operated. So courts and procedures were disrupted with many hearings adjourned. There was an acceleration move towards remote hearings and an operational backlog across the courts and tribunal service. Clinical experts were in short supply because many senior clinicians were redeployed, busy with frontline work or reluctant to travel and attend hearings. Legal practitioners flagged fewer available expert witnesses over the period where Lucy was awaiting trial, and police and CPS work also faced pandemic-related constraints, particularly in relation to staffing, access to witnesses, delays in non-urgent work. So the timing of investigative steps and the ability to schedule interviews or obtain contemporaneous statements could have been affected. So I asked this question of AI, did the prosecution bypass checks and balances? And it concludes here that remote working and backlogs can produce pragmatic shortcuts. Those practical frictions can make it harder for a defence to investigate or to obtain competing expert reports quickly, which can change how effectively defence teams contest prosecution evidence. Was the defence disadvantaged? Very plausibly, yes, in some respects. Locating and instructing medical experts during 2020 to 2021 was harder across the board. Travel and international witness availability was constrained, and the pre-trial case-building phase could be slowed or made more complex. The defence in any long, complex medical prosecution is heavily dependent on expert work, so shortages or delays can be material. The pandemic almost certainly made some investigative and preparatory tasks harder, and those constraints can advantage whatever side is less impeded by them, but claiming the pandemic let the prosecution simply bypass legal safeguards overstates what happened. Formal safeguards remained, and the full jury trial was held in person once courts were able to facilitate that. So I've just written here as well, furthermore, the response to COVID can be said to have significantly impacted on the timescales associated with the trial, meaning that Lucy spent longer in prison awaiting trial. So I think we can say that there was some impact. I don't think you can reasonably say Lucy didn't have a fair trial because of COVID, but I think it's reasonable to say there was some impact. Only the defence and prosecution would truly know the extent to which the process and things that they may wish to have done was impacted. It would give an explanation for some of the things that Ben Myers chose to do. I tried to imagine what the two consultants hoped to accomplish by putting unfounded accusations to the police. Am I correct that they had never met Dewi Evans prior to going to the police? It would make sense that they did, air embolism theory mentioned by all three. I cannot reach a sane conclusion as to what they thought would be achieved by such a deliberate act of toxic behaviour. So the first thing to say is we don't know whether they've met Dewi Evans or not. We don't have any evidence that they did meet him at any time. So therefore we have to presume that they haven't, given that we don't have any evidence that they did. In terms of what they hope to accomplish, I think whenever we're discussing this, there's a degree of speculation involved. I think it's fair to say that the consultants at one time had genuine concerns, although I know some people contest this. I ultimately don't know what was going through their mind. We can surmise this to a certain extent. There are self-serving reasons why they don't want to look at their own behaviour, why they don't want to look at the kind of calibre or capabilities of the unit as a whole. But I can't tell you why they did this. I can't tell you why they became so fixated with Lucy. I can't tell you why they became so fixated it was a criminal act. It was just an idea for which they had no evidential support. They got completely out of control. Obviously, some people believe that Lucy was targeted for whatever reason. I can't endorse that because I can't prove it, and I couldn't tell you why they did what they did. This was the thing that I found hardest to understand, and I think I understand it a bit more now, having done a lot of research and read a lot of documents and so forth, and thought about it quite a lot. But I still ultimately couldn't tell you why they put themselves in this position when it was so risky and so dangerous for them. But maybe they thought, we're consultants, we'll just do whatever we want, and we're bulletproof. Whatever happens, we are bulletproof, and no one, even if there's no problem, it's found there's no criminal act, it's not going to come back on us because we're too important. I don't know. This is all speculation, and I really can't give you a definitive answer, but I hope that's helpful. Amazing work as always. Thank you very much. I was thinking that Lucy was mentoring someone and recall her saying that the person was sticking to Lucy. So if that was the case, if a baby was hurt by Lucy, then wouldn't this person be a witness? I hope this question makes sense, and thank you. Yes, it does make sense. So Lucy, there was suggested by the nurses at one stage, by the nursing managers, and I'm sure they didn't want to do this, but it was a way of dealing with a difficult situation, that Lucy could engage in supervised practice. So she would have been fully supervised at all times, and the consultants rejected this and wanted her taken off the unit. Now, I find that very difficult to understand. Again, I can't give you a good reason for why they wouldn't accept supervised practice, but there may have been other nurses who were close to Lucy or whatever, but there was no one close enough that you could say, right, they were with Lucy all the time, like a man marker in football. There was no one that close that could be used as a defence, or that we could describe that person as a witness. I think there's enough people around, enough of the time, and the nature of a neonatal unit makes these acts extremely unlikely, phenomenally unlikely. But I don't think we can quite say, oh, there was someone who was there all the time, so she would have witnessed it, and so forth. So I hope that answers your question. Some thoughts. If the 2 reviews of 2016 were ignored by the lead consultants and managers, would another inquiry set the NHS on the correct path? The correct processes and procedures were already in place. Professor Hutton interviewed Dr. Pittman, Michelle Warden et al. It appears they were ignored or not enforced or worse, unresearched. Usually institutions have an expert in regulatory services to guide agencies through the correct processes. Do all the agencies concerned here have such a position? If pathways exist and are able to be ignored, where do you go next? So this is quite a deep question about the organisational structure of this particular hospital. I think that with regard to the first question, I mean, I'm not best placed. I must say, firstly, I'm not best placed or the most qualified person to answer this question, but I think it's very clear that there should have been a more deep inquiry into this hospital. In a sense, the consultants were right that they were wrong to ignore many elements of the Royal College report, but I think they were right to say it doesn't go far enough. But what shouldn't have happened was that the case went to police. What should have happened was either they came in with a fine-tooth comb and did it even more thoroughly and did more medical work, or another independent body such as the Care Quality Commission did it, or possibly even some other body of which I'm not aware. There should have been a very deep inquiry into that hospital, and particularly obviously the neonatal unit. I think that was justified, or possibly even mandatory, or it should have been mandatory. Again, I must emphasise that I'm not an expert. I'm absolutely nowhere near the best person to answer this question. But yes, all of the institutions involved in this issue have regulatory services, and that would apply to all the agencies concerned here. There is a very stringent, complex network involved with overseeing the NHS. If such pathways were ignored, which we believe, I don't know if it's right to describe it as them being ignored, but they weren't utilised, you could say. There's supposed to be, for example, the Care Quality Commission. The problem is the Care Quality Commission is criticised, but fundamentally, there should have been more inquiries into this hospital, and they should have gone to medical bodies. Whether or not those medical bodies are competent, whether or not they'll do a good enough job, we don't know. That's doubtful, debatable, under question, but there's no doubt the regulatory mechanisms exist and the agencies exist to do this. I'm not the best person to answer about the pathways and the practical reality of actually doing this within the NHS. But certainly all this exists theoretically. Hi Chris, just a quick question. Is there anything people can do to demand the CCRC employ more staff to move matters along, prolonging the agony of those held at His Majesty's pleasure? Very good question. I think in practical terms, no. Unfortunately not, because it's a state-level decision. I don't know if you feel you can influence the state, but I don't often feel that I can. Obviously, you can do all the usual things. You can lobby your MP, you can write to people, you can have all the usual doors slammed in your face that would occur when you try to advance anything. But if you don't try, then you don't achieve anything. I suppose, a kind of extreme response would be to engage in some form of activism where you try to raise more awareness of the importance of this, maybe petitioning, fundraising, if you feel that strongly about it. In terms of anything you can do to directly demand this, you have to get the ear of the government. As you know, that's very, very difficult. Why did Detective Hughes believe the consultants and then dodgy Evans, and what's more, let him lead the investigation without a second opinion and not engage further experts? This man has let Evans run the consultants who give suboptimal care to tiny babies. I'm angry and frustrated, but then again, they gave him a medal for it and hummingbird jewellery. So there is, again, this is yet another question where there isn't really a satisfactory answer. I don't know why Detective Hughes allowed this to happen. I don't know why he ignored the National Crime Agency. I don't know why he ignored several lines of investigation and inquiry, which to me are very obvious. I don't know why he allowed the investigation to proceed without a second opinion. I don't know why he didn't do due diligence on Evans. I don't know why Cheshire Police did nothing that you would associate with a competent constabulary. I've made the suggestion several times that, and Stephanie's made the same suggestion now, that it's just basically an intellectual deficit. I don't have a better explanation at this point in time. Why didn't the police go through everyone's work email, personal WhatsApp messages and personal texts? Everyone who worked on the unit should have been a suspect. Again, I don't have a good answer to this question. I think they'd centred in on Lucy because they decided, Lucy's there for more incidents due to their brilliant methodology of investigating this spike in deaths. So they'd never treat anyone else as a suspect because they decided Lucy's the suspect and they couldn't see the flaws in their own approach. So therefore they didn't collate all this information for everyone else because they didn't consider them to be suspects. As I've said myself previously, I've had a discussion with a guest that I haven't put this out yet, and we somewhat disagreed on this because the guest that I was speaking with said that Lucy just fit the bill for being a suspect. Whereas I said, I just think if Lucy hadn't been there, they would have pinned it on someone else. They would have blamed someone else. Someone else would have been around instead of Lucy. And they'd started seeing this person and they'd be saying, why is this nurse around so much? And she would have ended up being, the suspect. That's my belief. So, yeah, simply the reason they didn't do it was Lucy was around the most. They'd already decided Lucy was a suspect, so they just didn't bother, basically. Evans, with the agreement of Bohin and Marnarides, presented his expert opinion that Lucy Letby took the lives of baby CIMP by way of bolus of air via nasogastric tube. Johnson aggressively pursued it. The jury accepted that. Lucy was given 3 whole life orders. Evans later wrote to Channel 5 saying this was not the case and that bolus of air merely destabilised the babies. All this is well known. My question is, as it obviously brings into question Evans and his co-experts' conclusions at trial, then shouldn't these 3 cases be retried or at the very least be reduced to attempted murder? I cannot understand why more hasn't been made of this. Well, I think it has been made quite a lot of in the media, and it will be a major talking point when it goes to the Court of Appeal. I don't know how Evans can possibly defend himself. He's going to have an extremely difficult time at the Court of Appeal. There's no doubt about that. Whether I don't want to make predictions about the court and what it will do. It can do some very odd things at times. Clearly, the verdict for these cases is completely unsatisfactory and completely unsafe. That's very obvious. And frankly, they should just be quashed, never mind retried. We're going to have to see what happens with the retrial and quashing and so forth, but there's no way that these are safe convictions, as you rightly point out, so certainly something should happen in relation to them. I do wonder if the police had done what the NCA had advised, whether Evans would have jumped ship. A very good question, more an assertion, but it's very hard to say, but I don't think we can really know for sure. But he certainly wouldn't have wanted that, because he seemingly was involved in pointing to certain experts that were then involved in the court case. It would have been very difficult for him once you got proper doctors in there, but then again, we don't know what the other experts on the NCA list would have said or done. We've seen there's problems with expert witnesses. I don't think we can necessarily assume that other expert witnesses would have come in there and done a better job. Hopefully they would have done, but as this is all hypothetical, I guess we'll never know. It certainly would have been preferable to what occurred, that's for sure. The CPS knew that Mark would rip the prosecution apart with no control over which way the defence went or what they would do. If Lucy was acquitted, it would pile more pressure on the justice system. If, as you correctly state, there is little difference between the new charges and the one she was convicted on, then that begs the question, if the CPS were presented with the original case, knowing what we know now, would Lucy have gone to court in the first place? And I think the answer to that is no. If the CPS understood the case the first time round, this would not have gone to court. It shouldn't have gone to court. And I think, as you have kind of implied here, the fact that the Crown Prosecution Service has thrown out these very similar cases and said there is insufficient evidence indicates that if they'd have been staring down the barrel of 31 experts, the case would never have gone to court. That's just a simple reality. Hi Chris, hope you're well. A quick question. Could the CCRC and the CPS, when discussing what action to take, consider admitting that the trial should not have happened and as a result take a step to reassure and win back public confidence, if any, by reviewing the proposed procedures of, say, Anna Doherty with a view to revising how court officials handle complex medical issues? I don't believe this will ever go away, so they cannot ignore the outcry forever. The outcome can be positive when those in power just admit to mistakes. So I completely agree with your last sentence. There is a almost relentless reluctance among anyone in this country. I'm sure it occurs in other countries, but certainly in Britain, there's just such an overwhelming reluctance to admit mistakes or admit when people have done things wrong or admit errors. It's only when there's a scandal, there'll be a scandal, and then someone will resign occasionally. But kinds of, in terms of more material mistakes in everyday work, there is an enormous reluctance for anyone to concede these, and I don't know why, because you say that if they held their hands up and admitted to mistakes, it would increase confidence, the dwindling public confidence in the system. By trying to cover up their mistakes, it just diminishes confidence until it's virtually whittled away to nothing. With regard to the kind of central question here, I think it's very unpredictable as to whether this is going to be a retrial or if it's going to be quashed. It's very hard to say at this point in time. I think that I really wouldn't like to predict, because it's hard to see there being a retrial, but I also think there's going to be a kind of public need for this case to be tried again so that these arguments can go through a public process. But if it does go through a public process, the prosecution is going to be so outnumbered, it will almost be farcical. So I really have no idea what is going to happen and what the CCRC, what the CPS, Court of Appeal, who knows what they will do. If the Court of Appeal reject the appeal and try to use legalese, there's going to be an enormous outcry. If they quash the convictions, people are going to say, well, we don't definitively know that she's innocent. This is such a big, high-profile, controversial case with very serious allegations. It needs to be retried. If it's retried, it's hard to see how they can put together a prosecution case, and also putting a jury in place for it to be a fair trial is less than easy as well. I'm just glad it's me that doesn't have to make these decisions. I can just sit here hammering the system every day and be on very safe ground. But we'll just have to wait and see what happens. I would not like to make any predictions. What is the significance of the post-mortems to be conducted in February? So I won't go over this too much because Stephanie has discussed this in a previous video now. I didn't realise this question was in here. So if you go to see my recent interview with Stephanie and Steve Watts, then Stephanie Davis explains, or at least gives her view on the coronial process, which of course is a very informed view, as she used to be the senior coroner's officer for Cheshire. Do you think the Home Office proposal to create 2 large police departments will mean the eventual closure of Cheshire Police Force? Again, I'm probably not the best person to answer this question. I'd say broadly speaking, I'm not in favour of centralisation. I'm always in favour of devolution. So I don't necessarily see it as a good thing to have enormous police departments. It's just more bureaucracy, more red tape. They become more unwieldy organisations like the NHS. So I'm not really in favour of that. I don't think this investigation failed because Cheshire Police is a devolved power with regional responsibility. I think it failed because Cheshire Police were crap. As to whether these proposals could lead to the closure of Cheshire Police, I suppose that's an organisational possibility. As to whether Cheshire Police should face some serious measures, I believe that they should. However, I don't necessarily think the answer is, as I say, more centralisation. I think the answer is to better educate, better train and better inform police constabularies across the country so that they do a better job. Why did no one pay the price for the fact that the consultants did weekly instead of daily rounds? Isn't that simply negligent for vulnerable neonates? Well, again, it's not really my place to make that judgment about whether or not it's negligent. What I can say is that I've spoken to many experts, including numerous that have worked in paediatrics and neonatology, and I'm sure that they would all say that it is negligent. Or I certainly think the vast majority of them would say that it's negligent, and I'm certain that all of them would say it's unacceptable. In terms of why no one paid the price, again, this is hospital politics. The consultants are powerful. It's difficult to sack the consultants or get rid of the consultants because they're so important to the unit. It's difficult to bring in new consultants, etc., etc. So it's the kind of thing that just gets glossed over or brushed under the carpet rather than being addressed, even though it's in the Royal College report. It's not a secret. They knew they weren't doing enough ward rounds, and then they knew the monitoring on the unit was substandard. But, you know, such is the nature of these hierarchical organisations that the people near the top or at the top get away with it. When babies are transferred, do a full set of notes go with them? Yeah, absolutely. They certainly should. As an adult patient, I've had my care moved from one hospital to another and data did not transfer, nor were the different hospital computers talk to each other. I mean, that seems like another example of negligence because naturally, undoubtedly, your full set of notes should go because there could be something really critical. There could, for example, in your full set of notes, it could say, this patient we found out is allergic to something, or this patient had a negative reaction to this drug or this procedure or whatever it might be. That's critical clinical information that the hospital would need to know, particularly in a surgical scenario. So absolutely, your full set of notes should be transferred with you. And if they didn't, that is a failure. It's not that's normal practice. It's not normal practice. That's just a failure at the time. Did baby A have a partial blockage in its liver? So we'll look at the background of child A in order to answer this question. So you can see in the panel report here that the post-mortem of child A, or baby 1 as it's written here, showed a recent non-occluding thrombus in the liver, which is exactly as the question infers, a partial blockage. So the answer to that question is yes. So go back to the questions. Moving to Lucy herself, could she have known about the American case where a couple of nurses were found to have killed many babies? There the investigation found it was contaminated due to their long fingernails. No malfeasance, just long fingernails. If Lucy knew of this, would that have added to her fears that were written on the green notes? Not necessarily fingernails, but some unknown failing by her. Yeah, I mean, that's possible. Of course, I don't know. Again, this is completely speculative. It's clear that she wasn't in the most rational frame of mind when she wrote that letter. She was in a traumatised state. So all manner of things could be going through her head. We don't know what her thinking was. I don't think even Lucy would be able to remember the way she was thinking at that time. It's very difficult if you're in a traumatised state. But yeah, it's possible she could be aware of previous cases. It's possible that she could have been made more emotional by this possibility. I don't know, but of course I can't really say with any confidence whether or not that is the case. For a neonatal criminal court case, shouldn't all of Evans' evidence be thrown out, as he is not a neonatologist, either trained or experienced? In these cases, it has transpired should in the main not have been cared for in that unit, as they were clearly ITU level 3 cases. This seems the prosecution's fault. Clearly, it is their responsibility to provide appropriate experts, but also to be honest about their appropriateness. So I think there's a lot of issues here within this. So the first thing is, let's just leave aside whether or not Evans is a neonatologist. He should have been thrown out the case when Lord Justice Jackson wrote to Judge Goss. That should have been the end of Evans immediately. In my view, I've said this numerous times, the only reason that didn't happen, the only reason he wasn't thrown out, was because the judge bottled it, essentially. He didn't want to do it because he knew it was too big, he knew too much money had been spent, he knew it would make the criminal justice system look ridiculous, so he completely ducked the decision. He should be gone immediately. In terms of your question as to whether his evidence should be acceptable, not being a neonatologist, it clearly would be ideal for someone talking about neonates to be a neonatologist, but given that there's a neonatal unit without a neonatologist, I've never been able to understand this, but clearly paediatricians are able to preside over a neonatal unit. So in that sense, you could argue, leaving aside his other problems and leaving aside the fact he's retired and not even registered to practice when he joins the police investigation, leaving those issues aside, you could argue he's as qualified as the people that operate in the unit. So in that sense, his evidence is as valid as their right to look after neonates in the Council of Chester. The fact, another aspect of this that you rightly raise is that some of these were level 3 cases. I think that can't really be reasonably contested. And that does complicate things. Again, though, I would just point to the fact that paediatricians at the Council of Chester were presiding over these cases. So if they're presiding over these cases, then Dr. Evans could be viewed as having satisfactory expertise to give evidence in court in relation to them. In terms of whether it's the prosecution's fault, it absolutely is, but the police seemingly had no ability to recognise appropriate experts or indeed to do anything correctly at all. I don't think it's so much a case of them being dishonest. I think they're just incompetent. Although it was all there in black and white for them, it was all there in the notes, it was all there from the National Crime Agency. They were told what to do, and they just failed to do it. Now, why they can't do what they're told, I don't know. I would be speculating. But essentially, it should be the job of the prosecution to provide appropriate experts, but increasingly it seems, or maybe it's not increasingly, maybe it's always been this way, the prosecution views its job as winning, not providing accurate information to the court. So in a way, for the prosecution, Dr. Evans is the ideal expert because he's seemingly willing to say absolutely anything under any circumstances. So in a way, that's better than someone, from the prosecution's perspective, that's better than the top expert in the world with the best medical qualifications and understanding, because they might trip the prosecution up. They probably would trip the prosecution up, whereas Dr. Evans will just say whatever's needed. So in a way, he is the ideal expert for the prosecution. But as you rightly say, in an ideal world, they would be honest about the appropriateness of Dr. Evans, but they have no incentive to do that because their job is to win. It's a crazy system. It's absolutely crazy. It needs to change. There needs to be an inquisitorial approach in these complex cases. And I know that's not perfect. We're never going to have a perfect system, but the adversarial system just leads to this we must win at all costs mentality. And the fact that Dr. Evans has succeeded in the court system is a very obvious manifestation of that. That to me is the most in plain sight inference from Shuley's conference and panel of now 30 real experts giving their opinion. So, sorry, that's just following on from the previous question. Isn't it a gross error and incompetence by the prosecution in the process for allowing an imposter to opine as an expert in neonatology? So I've kind of answered this question already. So I'll just move on. I mean, the question here is whether it should be struck out. He didn't look at the obstetric data. Yeah, so I've said already Dr. Evans should be struck out of the process, definitely. But ultimately, the authorities make this decision. The prosecution aren't going to do it. It's not in their interest. The judge failed to do it because he bottled it, in my opinion. He just didn't have the guts to throw him out. He knew that the trial would fail immediately. He knew the court would look ridiculous. Numerous other bodies and organisations would look ridiculous. And he just didn't have the guts to do it, even though objectively Evans should have been gone. No doubt. I think there's another question here about the prosecution, so I'll move on to the next one. Just to repeat a question I posed last time, I cannot recollect seeing any solicitor input during Lucy's 3 separate arrests. There are some obscure references to a solicitor involved with house purchase. Why was no one available or willing to say this nonsense needs to stop? So I've seen multiple transcripts of Lucy's police interviews, and in all the transcripts I've seen, she never says no comment once. It's now evident from the Netflix documentary that having been asked these questions multiple times, she said no comment, having already answered the questions. So perhaps the solicitor did say to her at this point, you don't need to continue to answer these questions, Lucy, you've answered them several times previously. So he's had some minimal input as to why he didn't give more. You've heard from a solicitor on this channel. She was balanced and fair in her comments, but critical of him nevertheless. So this is yet another question where I don't have a good answer. I don't know why the solicitor didn't do a better job. Maybe the solicitor was out of his depth. We just don't know. All I can say is I believe the solicitor should have advised Lucy more and been involved more. And there was an argument. I did put this question to Stephanie, and she said, I don't think it'd make any difference. She knows better than me. She's dealt with them directly. But I do think there's an argument for Lucy saying no comment, no comment, no comment, and then issuing a lengthy document with dozens, if not hundreds of pages. That might have been a better way to go. I don't know if you're under police questioning, if you can say, can I have all these questions written down, please, and I'll submit written responses. I'm not sure. That would always be my inclination, because I know I can give a very good account of myself that way. So I'm not really sure. I don't know what the solicitor was doing. I don't know what he was thinking, but what he wasn't doing was representing Lucy particularly well. It seems to me that the establishment are fighting hard against this being overturned. The question is why? Well, there's 2 things to say about this. The first thing is there will definitely be institutional resistance for numerous reasons. Firstly, it makes the criminal justice system and many of the organisations from the criminal justice system look ridiculous, and they don't like to be made to look ridiculous. It's not great for the state, because the state is ultimately responsible, even though it always says, oh, we can't interfere because it's the judicial system. But the state is, even though they argue against this, the state is responsible for setting the parameters of the judicial system. So the failure of the judicial system directly reflects on the state and on the government. So therefore, they don't want cases to be overturned. If something is not overturned, then the state can always reflect on it and think, right, well, the fact that it's not been overturned means that it's a sound and safe conviction. Of course, in reality, that's ridiculous. But they'd rather not have these big headlines of massive miscarriage of justice. So there's going to be institutional resistance from the judiciary, from the criminal justice system as a whole, from the government. In terms of whether they're fighting hard, things have actually progressed fairly well for Lucy in a time frame that is competitive compared to what would usually occur. So we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. There may be a tacit acceptance that something needs to happen. We just don't know at this point in time. As a pound shot Poirot in Dr. Evans' eyes, all I've read about this case led me to the conclusion that it was systemic failings with the unit and suboptimal care, poor choices made by the consultants. The question is, wouldn't that have been a more suitable criteria for medical malpractice, and would it be the police that would initiate that line of inquiry? Would it have come out in the inquest? Why did the police jump to the conclusion that it was murder in the first instance? So let's take these questions one by one. It's clear that I don't know if it would quite accurately be described as medical malpractice. Failings on the unit is typically the term I would use. I don't know if it would quite qualify as being malpractice as such. It would kind of need to be the police that initiate that line of inquiry once the police have been contacted. As I've said earlier in this video, what should happen is that the hospital should initiate a medical inquiry, and then at that point it would be the responsibility of that medical inquiry to assess whether it's, as you put it, medical malpractice, medical failure, however they may choose to define this. Once it's gone to the police, then it is the police's responsibility to initiate such inquiry. I think it can be very clearly stated that now we've heard from them in this latest Netflix documentary, on top of everything else we knew previously, they're just not up to that level. They're just not capable of doing something of that nature. They just don't have the intellectual capacity. They didn't have the intellectual capacity to run this investigation competently. They're not going to be able to investigate the unit and decide whether or not there's been medical malpractice. It could have come out in an inquest, as you suggest, or a wider inquiry into the unit. And the reason the police jumped to the conclusion it was murder was because it's kind of, there's numerous reasons. The first one is they believe the consultants for reasons of class. Primarily, I think it's class, and I think there's a gender element to it as well. I know Susie Holt was in the interview, but it's still largely men ganging up on a female nurse. And I do think there's a gender element, but I think the class element is very significant. They just believed the consultants. I think a second reason is just abject stupidity and an inability to examine the areas of investigation that they should, and the avenues that they should have examined, just due to incompetence and stupidity. And the third reason is I believe they became overexcited by the prospect of doing a major investigation, and that coloured the whole direction of the investigation. So I think it's several reasons collectively. I think it's reasonable, as you described it, they jumped to a conclusion, but ultimately they just didn't know how to do a competent investigation, and so that they failed. They completely failed as a constabulary. So I'm going to answer these two final questions, and I'll leave the other questions for next time, so I don't want this video to go on too long. It would be roughly an hour and a half, and that seems fine. Can I ask if it was not a good move for Lucy to give evidence at all? So this is a good question. So firstly, we'd need to understand why Ben Myers put Lucy into the witness box to give evidence. And I have my own theory on this that I think is credible. And I think essentially the reason he did it was to try to make Lucy appear to be a sympathetic character. Of course, now she is a sympathetic character, but I think he was trying to show this is a normal nurse, this is a woman. He's humanising her. He's trying to show this is a decent human being who's doing a good job, an important job. She was trying the best she could. She's a decent person. She's been through a traumatic experience. Whether that can balance against the testimony of parents, I don't know. But I think it's trying to give some emotional testimony in this emotional case in which the prosecution used emotion. They weaponised emotion. We keep using this word weaponised, but that was yet another thing that was weaponised against Lucy. So I think that was the reason they put Lucy in the witness box. The next thing we need to reflect on is whether Lucy gave a good account of herself, and I think she did give a good account of herself, and other people that have more experience than me say that she gave a fantastic account of herself. She's clearly an intelligent person. She gave intelligent answers in the police interviews. She gave intelligent answers in court. She's clearly knowledgeable about her area that she worked in, and she was clearly passionate about it, and that's why she's able to give these excellent answers and speak very fluently. There are a couple of things she could have done differently, both in the police interviews and in court. Whether that would have helped her or not, I don't know, but there are moments where she could have given a bit more emotion and been a bit less monosyllabic, but it's understandable that we know the reasons why she was a little bit diffident, you could describe it as, because she was broken. At the start of the trial, she was literally broken. I read it out in a recent video. She literally couldn't speak. I think under those circumstances, her performance is even more extraordinary, frankly, that she was able to perform to that level when she'd been broken down to an absolute shell of what she is and the human being that she typically would be. So in that respect, I think it went quite well. The arguments against it would be, firstly, was she in a fit state to give evidence, considering what we've just described? And then there were a few aspects of it that arguably didn't go quite according to plan, because the prosecution gave her a hammering, as they always do. That's inevitable. If you put someone in the witness box, the prosecution will attack them and they'll score points off them. Dr. Evans got hammered all the way through the trial, from what I've seen of it. But that doesn't mean that it was a mistake. I think it was a gamble that was worth taking under the circumstances when we'd heard, the court and the jury had heard emotional testimony from parents. It was an attempt to balance that out, and they got to see that Lucy was a knowledgeable nurse, and they got to see Lucy was a decent person. And now we've all had the benefit of hearing that. So we can look back at the cross-examination and we can look back at what she said, and that gives us more idea of what she's like as a person. So I think overall, although it didn't exonerate her, it was a gamble that paid off. It wasn't good enough to get the result that Lucy would have wanted, of course, but I think that she was able to show herself, and that's why Ben Myers did it. And I think ultimately it probably was a good move in the circumstances of this trial. Of course, it would have been much better if Lucy had had defence witnesses as she would now. But there's something I want to mention at this point while we're on the topic. Ironically, it's probably a good thing that Lucy didn't have defence witnesses called, because now that hasn't been in court. So the Court of Appeal or anyone else can't say, well, she had this witness acting in her defence, this witness, etc., etc. And those that would have acted in defence for Lucy at the time would have raised points, probably, that are in the panel's submission and that will be in Lucy's defence going forward. So in a sense, excluding them from the court case, even though in the short term that was bad for Lucy, potentially, in the medium to long term, in what we're doing now with working on her appeal, it may be very much beneficial for her. How long do you think it will take until Lucy's released, and will she be compensated? So I've discussed this previously. So when I saw the Sun newspaper front page, that was the first time I thought we possibly could get Lucy out by next year. That would be an optimistic scenario. I think the CCRC will refer this year. I think it'll be relatively soon. And then I think it'll go to the Court of Appeal more quickly than previous cases, because there'll be a public need to fast track this and deal with it as quickly as possible. It's not inevitable that Lucy will win that appeal, but let's assume she did for the sake of argument. Then it would be a case of whether or not there's a retrial. If there's a retrial, there can be a long delay in judicial cases, but again, I think it would be fast tracked, and I think the retrial would occur, within a reasonable time frame. So Mark McDonnell was talking about possibly referred in summer of this year, maybe 8 months, he said, to Court of Appeal, maybe he said possibly 18 months for a retrial, but I think it would be fast-tracked. So then the retrial would take place in 2028. So you're looking at anything from 2027 to 2029, 2030, depending on various timeframes. Depending on what happens, depending on if there's a retrial, depending on if the cases are quashed, depending on the delays that are involved, depending on the Court of Appeal decision. But it will be somewhere in that ballpark, with I think the most optimistic scenario being next year. In terms of whether Lucy will be compensated, there's going to be enormous pressure if she's exonerated for her to receive compensation, owing to the horrendous ordeal that she's been through. Typically, she wouldn't be compensated, because she can't be... The crazy thing about this case is she can't be proved to be innocent, because you can't prove someone to be innocent of something that hasn't happened. So in a case of like Malkinson, for example, Andrew Malkinson, there definitely was a rape, and he definitely didn't do it because DNA cleared him, so therefore he's definitely innocent. in a sense, it's impossible to ever do that with Lucy because she was at the scene and she's been accused of something that hasn't happened. It's not like there's another suspect, or you can say definitively, right, well, she definitely didn't do this, because the thing that she definitely didn't do was never done by anyone else. So that usually isn't enough to get compensation, but there will be enormous pressure on the system to compensate her under these circumstances, and I'm sure David Davis and others will campaign for this, and there'll be a general political understanding that she needs to be compensated. Plus, I think she will receive funds from other sources as well, undoubtedly. So I do think she'll be compensated, but I don't think it's inevitable that it'll happen immediately. I think there'll be, who knows what will go on behind the scenes. But typically, ironically, as I say, usually she wouldn't be, and it's not guaranteed that she'll be compensated. Okay, so that answers all the questions for this session. I've got a few left over for the next one, so I'll record session 11 at some point in March. Please do leave any more questions you have in this video and other videos, and I'll try to collect them. I've been very busy. I'm getting an enormous amount of notifications recently, so it's got harder to collect the questions or respond to the comments, but I do the best that I can. And please do leave comments because it really helps the videos, it helps the algorithms. I do read them as much as I can, I do respond as much as I can, so it's all very much appreciated. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video and I look forward to reading your comments.